1 year, 12 months of executive orders, tariffs, deportations, and confrontations with allies and adversaries alike. The speeches are over. The rallies have faded into background noise. What remains is the record. Not what was promised in campaign speeches or shouted at podiums, but what was actually done. And what was done is now rippling through the American economy, reshaping alliances that took decades to build, and altering the daily lives of millions of people who may not yet fully understand how much has changed. This is not about rhetoric. This is about consequences. When Donald Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, he arrived with a mandate he interpreted as absolute. The Republican Party controlled both chambers of Congress. The Supreme Court had already signaled its willingness to expand executive authority, and the administrative state, weakened by years of political warfare, offered less resistance than it had during his first term. The conditions were set for the most aggressive use of presidential power in modern American history, and that is precisely what followed. The tariffs came first. Within weeks of taking office, Trump imposed sweeping duties on Chinese goods, expanding the trade war that had defined his first administration into something far more comprehensive. The initial 10% tariff announced in February quickly escalated. By April, duties on Chinese imports had reached 145% on certain categories of goods. The justification shifted depending on the audience. Sometimes it was about fentanyl. Sometimes it was about trade deficits. Sometimes it was about national security. But the policy itself was consistent. Raise barriers, punish foreign producers, force manufacturing back to American soil. The theory was simple. Make imported goods expensive enough and companies will have no choice but to build factories in the United States. American workers will benefit. American industry will revive. The trade deficit will shrink. But economic theory and economic reality are not the same thing. The immediate effect was price increases. Consumer goods that relied on Chinese components or manufacturing became more expensive almost overnight. Electronics, appliances, clothing, toys. The categories touched nearly every American household. The Peterson Institute for International Economics estimated that the cumulative tariff burden would cost the average American family between $1,200 and $2,600 per year in additional expenses. That estimate proved conservative. Retailers absorbed what they could, then they passed the rest to consumers. Walmart raised prices on thousands of items. Target followed. Amazon sellers adjusted their algorithms. By summer, inflation that had finally begun to stabilize after years of pandemic-era disruption started climbing again. The Federal Reserve, which had been cautiously considering rate cuts, reversed course. Interest rates remained elevated. Mortgages stayed expensive. The housing market, already stretched beyond the reach of many first-time buyers, froze further. But the tariffs were not applied in isolation. They were part of a broader strategy that included secondary sanctions, export controls, and pressure on allied nations to align with American trade policy. Canada found itself caught in the crossfire almost immediately. The relationship between Washington and Ottawa deteriorated faster than anyone anticipated. Trump had always viewed Canada with suspicion, convinced that the northern neighbor was exploiting American generosity through unfair trade practices. When Mark Carney became prime minister, that suspicion hardened into hostility. Carney represented everything Trump despised: a former central banker, an internationalist, a leader who spoke the language of multilateral cooperation and climate commitments. The clash was inevitable. It began with automobiles. The United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, negotiated during Trump's first term, was supposed to have settled the question of North American trade. But Trump treated the agreement as a starting point for renegotiation, not a binding commitment. He accused Canada of allowing Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers to establish assembly operations that would then export finished cars to the American market duty-free. The claim was exaggerated, but it provided the pretext he needed. By March, Trump had imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, echoing the tactics of his first term. Canada retaliated with targeted duties on American bourbon, orange juice, and agricultural products. The tit-for-tat escalation continued through the spring. By summer, the integrated supply chains that had defined North American manufacturing for 3 decades were under unprecedented strain. Auto plants in Michigan that depended on Canadian parts faced production delays. Agricultural exporters in the Midwest watched as their Canadian markets closed. The border that had been the busiest trading corridor in the world became a checkpoint for economic warfare between nominal allies. The consequences extended beyond trade statistics. The diplomatic relationship itself fractured. Carney delivered a speech at Davos that was interpreted in Washington as a direct challenge to American leadership. He spoke of a ruptured international order and the need for middle powers to chart independent courses. He did not mention Trump by name. He did not need to. The message was clear. Canada would no longer defer automatically to American preferences. It would seek its own path, including deeper ties with Europe and selective engagement with China. Trump responded with threats: 100% tariffs if Canada pursued a trade agreement with Beijing, suggestions that the border itself might need to be reconsidered, rhetoric that oscillated between economic pressure and something closer to territorial ambition. The relationship that had survived world wars and cold wars and every previous political disagreement was now defined by open antagonism. And Canada was not alone. The tariff regime extended to Europe, to Mexico, to allies across Asia. The European Union faced duties on steel, aluminum, and automobiles. Mexico, despite the existing trade agreement, found itself targeted with threats tied to immigration enforcement. Japan and South Korea watched as the security relationships they had relied upon for decades became transactional calculations rather than strategic commitments. The cumulative effect was a fragmentation of the Western economic order. Countries that had built their prosperity on open trade with the United States began hedging. They signed agreements with each other. They explored alternatives to dollar-denominated transactions. They questioned whether American commitments could be trusted beyond the current administration. The architecture of globalization that the United States had constructed and led since 1945 was being dismantled by its original architect. But trade was only one dimension of the transformation. Immigration enforcement underwent an equally dramatic shift. The deportation machinery that had operated at varying intensities under previous administrations was rebuilt into something far more aggressive. Trump signed executive orders declaring a national emergency at the southern border within his first week. He invoked authorities that previous presidents had used sparingly or not at all. The Alien Enemies Act of 1798, a wartime statute designed for conflicts with foreign nations, was dusted off and applied to immigration enforcement. Legal challenges followed immediately, but the courts that might have restrained such actions proved hesitant or sympathetic. Immigration and customs enforcement received expanded funding and expanded authority. Workplace raids increased dramatically. Deportation flights operated daily to destinations across Latin America and beyond. The numbers climbed into the hundreds of thousands within the first 6 months. The human consequences were immediate and visible. Families separated, communities disrupted. Workers who had lived in the United States for decades, who had children who were American citizens, who had built businesses and paid taxes and contributed to their neighborhoods, found themselves detained and removed with minimal due process. But the economic consequences took longer to manifest. They are manifesting now. The agricultural sector felt it first. Farms across California, Florida, Texas, and the Midwest depended on immigrant labor for planting and harvesting. When that labor force contracted suddenly, crops rotted in fields. Produce prices spiked. Farmers who had supported the crackdown in principle found themselves unable to operate their businesses in practice. The disconnect between political preference and economic reality became impossible to ignore. Construction followed. The home building industry, already struggling with high interest rates and elevated material costs, faced a labor shortage that no amount of wage increases could immediately solve. Projects slowed, timelines extended. The housing supply that everyone agreed was insufficient became even more constrained. Restaurants, hotels, meatpacking plants, landscaping companies. Sector after sector reported the same pattern. Workers who had filled essential roles for years were gone, and there was no one to replace them. The unemployment rate remained low, but that was not because the economy was healthy, it was because the labor force itself was shrinking faster than demand. The administration's response was to promise that American workers would fill these jobs once wages rose high enough. But labor markets do not adjust on political timelines. Training takes years. Relocation requires incentives that were not being offered, and many of the jobs in question, the back-breaking agricultural work, the dangerous meatpacking shifts, the long hours in extreme conditions, simply did not attract sufficient domestic workers at any price point employers could afford while remaining competitive. The result was a strange economic landscape. Inflation persisted, labor shortages persisted, growth slowed. The stock market, which had initially celebrated the return of a business-friendly administration, grew volatile as the full implications became clear. The contradictions of the policy agenda could no longer be papered over with optimism. And then there was energy. The administration moved aggressively to expand domestic oil and gas production. Drilling permits on federal lands increased. Environmental reviews were streamlined or eliminated. The regulatory apparatus that had constrained fossil fuel development was dismantled piece by piece. The message was consistent: American energy dominance. Drill everywhere. Produce everything. Worry about consequences later. But the energy market does not respond to executive orders. It responds to prices and investment cycles and global demand. American oil production was already near record levels when Trump took office. The additional permits and reduced regulations did not immediately translate into dramatically increased output. Companies that had been burned by previous boom and bust cycles remained cautious about capital expenditure. They returned profits to shareholders rather than drilling new wells. Meanwhile, the broader energy infrastructure continued to deteriorate. Refineries that had operated for decades announced closures. The economics of processing heavy crude in a regulatory environment that changed with each administration proved untenable for long-term planning. Companies looked at the capital requirements, looked at the political uncertainty, and decided to exit. California became the most visible example of this dynamic. The Phillips 66 refinery in Los Angeles shut down. Valero announced plans to close its Benicia facility. Together, these closures eliminated nearly 20% of the state's refining capacity. The immediate effect was predictable. Gas prices in California climbed towards $7 and $8 per gallon. The neighboring states that depended on California's fuel infrastructure, Arizona and Nevada, saw their own prices spike. The administration blamed California's regulations. California blamed the administration's broader policy chaos. But the underlying reality was simpler. The energy transition that everyone acknowledged was coming, whether through policy or through market forces, was happening in the most disorderly way possible. No one was planning. Everyone was reacting. And consumers were paying the price at the pump. The foreign policy consequences proved equally significant. The Venezuela operation in early January 2026 marked a dramatic escalation of American military intervention in the Western Hemisphere. The capture of Nicolas Maduro demonstrated the continued reach of American Special Operations Forces, but it also demonstrated something else: the willingness of this administration to use military force in ways that previous administrations had considered unacceptable. The international reaction was swift and largely negative. Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Chile, countries that had themselves criticized Maduro's government, condemned the operation as a violation of sovereignty. The United Nations Security Council convened emergency sessions. Legal scholars declared the action a violation of international law. The rules-based order that the United States had championed for 80 years was now being undermined by its original guarantor. The strategic consequences are still unfolding. China, which had invested billions in Venezuela over 2 decades, did not respond with military force. It did not need to. It simply continued positioning itself as the alternative, the patient partner, the nation that offered investment without regime change. Every country in the global south watching the Venezuela operation reached the same conclusion. Partnership with Washington now carried risks it had not carried before. The dollar's position as the world's reserve currency, already under pressure from years of sanctions and financial weaponization, faced new questions. If the United States would use military force to secure access to resources, if it would kidnap a sitting head of state and put him on trial in New York, then holding dollar-denominated assets became a strategic vulnerability rather than a safe haven. The de-dollarization trend that had been building for years accelerated. Central banks increased gold purchases. Alternative payment systems expanded. The BRICS nations, now including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and other major energy producers, moved forward with plans for settlement mechanisms that bypassed American financial infrastructure entirely. The process will take years to complete, but the direction is now unmistakable. At home, the political landscape has shifted in ways that will outlast any single administration. The regulatory agencies that once provided continuity across presidential transitions have been hollowed out. Experienced staff departed. Institutional knowledge vanished. The capacity of the federal government to implement policy, any policy, has been degraded. A future administration that wanted to reverse course would find itself starting from a weakened foundation. The courts have been reshaped at every level. The judges appointed during Trump's first term have been joined by dozens more. The legal interpretations that constrained executive power have been replaced by interpretations that expand it. The precedents being set now will shape American law for decades. The norms that governed political behavior, the unwritten rules about what presidents could and could not do, have been systematically dismantled. What was once unthinkable became controversial. What was controversial became normal. The boundaries that limited political combat have been erased. Whatever comes next will operate in a landscape where fewer constraints exist, and the American public itself has been changed by a year of constant confrontation. The exhaustion is palpable. The attention that once focused on each new outrage has diffused into a kind of ambient resignation. People have stopped following the daily developments. They have retreated into their immediate concerns. The civic engagement that democracy requires has given way to protective disengagement. This is the record of 1 year. Not the promises, not the speeches, not the tweets and the rallies and the endless media coverage, just the actions and their consequences. The tariffs raised prices and fractured alliances. The deportations disrupted communities and created labor shortages. The regulatory rollbacks failed to produce the energy boom that was promised. The military intervention demonstrated capability but undermined legitimacy. The economic growth that was supposed to justify everything has not materialized. The stock market has been volatile. Inflation has persisted, the deficit has grown, and the world has responded by hedging against American power rather than aligning with it. The allies have grown distant, the adversaries have grown bolder, the neutral nations have begun building alternatives. None of this was inevitable. Policy choices have consequences. Different choices would have produced different outcomes, but these were the choices that were made. And these are the consequences that followed. The question now is what happens next? The administration shows no signs of changing course. The confrontations with allies continue. The tariffs remain in place. The deportation flights still depart daily. The military posture toward nations that resist American preferences has only grown more aggressive. The second year will build on the first. The trends that have been established will continue unless something interrupts them. The economic pressures will compound. The diplomatic isolation will deepen. The institutional damage will accumulate. Some argue that this is a necessary disruption, that the old order was failing anyway, that the pain of transition will give way to a new and better arrangement, that American strength, asserted forcefully enough, will eventually compel the world to accommodate. Perhaps. But the evidence of the first year does not support that optimism. The evidence suggests that strength without strategy produces chaos. That disruption without a plan for what comes next leaves everyone worse off. That allies alienated do not return easily. That trust destroyed takes generations to rebuild. 1 year is not enough time to judge a presidency, but it is enough time to see the trajectory. It is enough time to observe the pattern. It is enough time to understand that what is happening is not an accident or a miscalculation. It is a deliberate choice to remake America's relationship with the world and with its own institutions. The consequences of that choice are now visible. They will become more visible with each passing month. And the question that every American must eventually answer is whether these consequences were worth it, whether the disruption produced the renewal that was promised, or whether it simply produced disruption. The record is being written, the evidence is accumulating, and history, which does not care about intentions or rhetoric or political theater, will judge what was actually done.